Hi. So we're here at yes, we're here at ADDC, and yeah, as our friend said, I'm an iOS developer. I'm very passionate about design, and when I heard about this conference, I was really excited because I'm very active in the iOS community, but I don't get to speak to a large group of designers as well, and yeah, I wanted to basically cover the same topic that Fernando covered, but from a slightly different angle, and talk about the designer and developer relationship. So if we think about the relationship between designers and developers, it's often characterized as one of conflict and dysfunction. We come from different places, we have different skills, and we're kind of forced to work together. But actually we have a common goal, and we want to build these transformative and delightful products. And we can only do that if we collaborate really, really well. So this is what the talk is about. And let's start by looking at the industry and where we are today. So when we talk about app development, we're really talking about what started with the iPhone. And the iPhone was made by a company called Apple. And Apple's very big on design. So this is a slide that Steve Jobs put up twice in his last two keynotes, trying to explain Apple's DNA, and said that they live on this intersection of technology and liberal arts, and that's why we have fonts and all the exciting things that Apple does. And a lot of the decisions that they made when building the iPhone were kind of based on these ideas, and they sort of put design in the center of that thinking. And that basically led us to this skeuomorphic era of apps. So the first couple of apps, there was a brand new computing paradigm. You wanted to teach people how to use it, so they recreated things that exist in the real world. So we had a lot of felt and wood and shiny things, and these apps were really beautiful and really exciting and kind of magical because you never really knew what kind of user interface you'll get. But they were very hard to design, and that was a lot of work for designers. You needed designers who were very capable at producing these kind of things. However, as iPhones became more popular and smartphones became more popular, people got used to these paradigms, and these designs got old very quickly. And then we got to this sort of flattish era where we are today. So we have, with iOS 7 and Google's material designs, apps became a lot more about white space and typography and simplicity. And it's much, much simpler to do an app that appears high-end. And it doesn't require as much of a design skill, perhaps, as these beautiful rendered felt and wood interfaces. So basically, we'll have a lot of these screens with this purple background, and they are kind of takeaways, I guess. And I think as design became easier, as at least the baseline of design became easier, of good design on mobile, actually getting delight became a lot harder. And having something that stands out, that makes users happy, that does something in a unique way, is actually really, really difficult. And with this transition, we kind of became a bit confused. I think there's a bit of confusion both from developers and designers about what our roles are and how we should work together. You see very famous iOS developers like Marco Arment, who worked on Overcast and Instapaper. When iOS 7 came out, he said that basically before he couldn't really do design because it needed all these rich skills. But now when design is all about simplicity and typography and space, that's something that's kind of easier to master and easier to produce something that's possible as a high-end app. And he didn't use a designer at all for Overcast. And on the other side, designers are also questioning the role. So there's this big conversation about should designers code? And whether they need to do that in order to bring more value and to be able to do better, more exciting things. So yes, the way it's going to go today, I'm going to share with you 3 stories and kind of share some learnings and takeaways. And hopefully we can learn more about how to work better together. So the first story is not actually about designers and developers. So our field has existed relatively a short amount of time, so less than 10 years. I'm going to talk about architects and engineers. So they have kind of a similar relationship, and they've been doing it for much, much longer. So when you think about architects, architects are a lot like designers. They're kind of concerned about designing a beautiful building and balancing the needs of the different stakeholders of the building, so the users and the clients, and really produce these beautiful plans for what the building could be. And then those plans are brought to civil engineers, and they are more concerned with practical solutions. We're building a building that, basically how to build it, a building that will be sustainable, cost-effective, and that's basically what they do. So it's a very similar relationship to what we have with designers and engineers. And the building that I want to talk about is the Sydney Opera House, which is there. And it's one of the most iconic buildings in the world, and it has a very unique creation story. So these are the developers and designers of the Sydney Opera House. Utzon was a Danish designer, and Arup was the engineer that built the building. And basically, it all started with a competition. The Australian government basically opened this competition for building a new event space in Sydney. And what they did, which was interesting, is that, first of all, it was open to everyone, and they didn't really have a spec. They said, like, basically do whatever you want. And they got a lots of different ideas from people. And actually, Utzon design, which it looks like this, it was just a diagram. And it didn't really consider the practicalities of building this kind of building. And it was immediately put in the rejects pile and was looked off. And like, people looked at other things. But then someone found it and really fell in love with the idea. And eventually, it won the competition in 1957. And they decided to go with it, even though they didn't really know how to build it. And yeah. One big feature of the building were these sort of interlocking shells and kind of like these organic designs. And again, when Utzon did these, it was just a drawing. It was just him curving curving his pen. And he didn't really think about how to build them, what kind of shape this is, how you would define it geometrically. So these were the shells, and basically this began a collaboration process with the builders, and it took 6 years of prototyping. They tried so many different ways to define these shapes, and they just couldn't find the right one that could be fabricated cheaply in a way that could be repeated. And it got to a point where even like the Australian government decided, considered like replacing the engineers and making big changes to this plan. And people got really, really frustrated. But the solution didn't come from the engineer, it came from the designer. So Utzon actually, one night, he was sitting in his office, and he realized that the shells could actually form a part of a sphere, and were basically sort of cutouts of the sphere, like you can see there. And this was a real breakthrough, and it really changed the way, it basically enabled people to build this building. It defined how it will be tiled and how it will be structurally sound. And it's considered a real breakthrough in architecture. And basically, I think the learning here is that even though we have very distinct professions, none of us have a monopoly on clever solutions. And actually, a lot of times in my work as a developer, a lot of the solutions sometimes come from the designers, like engineering solutions about how to do difficult visual work. You should listen to your designers because you don't necessarily, you don't have the monopoly on the solution. So the building was completed in 1965. It's really beautiful, iconic World Heritage site. So that's a big success. As a project, it was 10 years late and almost 14 times over budget. So not so great for that. But it opened up a lot of innovation. And it allowed for amazing buildings like Frank Gehry's Guggenheim in Bilbao. And it was the first time people used CAD on a large scale. And basically, by pursuing something that was seen as impossible and really fighting to get it done, they opened up innovation and delight and a really beautiful building. So I think as developers, a lot of us have this mindset that our job is to limit a designer's imagination and tell them what's possible. And I think by doing that, we are also like limiting what's possible ourselves. And we are basically blocking innovation and new ideas from coming. And this is something that we need to get over as developers. And that's a takeaway. The second thing I want to talk about is reverse engineering design. So a lot of us think of design as basically how it looks. And design is actually more about imagining experiences within constraints. And yes, these constraints include beauty and taste, but it's also the user journey and the various stakeholders of the app. And coding is actually very similar. It's about solving problems within constraints. And we solve problems with the constraints of the OS and the APIs we use and the languages and what's capable on the device. So we're actually coming from different directions, but we're coming to solve the same problems. And I think one big takeaway is that great design can actually be a great engineering challenge. And things that appear difficult can be like really interesting problems to solve for engineers. So this is a story basically when the new-ish generation Apple TV came out, which I think was 2 years ago. I was really excited. It was a new Apple product, new App Store. I bought it immediately. And when I started using it, I saw that they had this like cool parallax effect on buttons. So when you sort of moved your hand on the remote, the buttons will reveal like this crazy 3D effect. And I thought this was amazing, and I really wanted to basically figure out how to build that. And like, just think of basically a designer coming up with that and giving that to a developer and saying, like, do this. So that's kind of the challenge that I set myself. And basically, I went about it with the same approach as like reverse engineering any other thing that we do. So I took the same tools for reverse engineering on iOS. We have a tool called class dump, which gives you a list of headers, and you can see the function names, and that kind of can give you a hint about how things are done. There's an app called Reveal that basically breaks down the view hierarchy in a very nice visual way, so you can understand what happens that way. And also, like, it's a bit more basic, but just like looking inside the package and seeing if you can find resources that explain how things work. So actually, for this effect, Apple released a tool, which is the Parallax icon builder. And it was there for developers to create these kind of icons for their apps. So I looked into this bundle, and I found this file, which was like ns-stacked highlight specular image. And I didn't know what specular was. And I thought of this, like, these biscuits or the paste. But turns out that specular is just a way of describing like the shadow effect that these 3D things have. And so I learned a lot about that, and that kind of informed my approach for trying to recreate this effect. And eventually I came up with a solution which involves like a rotation on the X, Y, Z axis, a translation on X, Y, scale, and a shadow. So there's a lot of stuff happening. But it looks really cool. It looks yeah, it looks a lot like the effect Apple have. Yeah. So I put it up on GitHub, got a really nice email from an engineer at Facebook saying it really inspired him. It's used in some apps for some reason. Yeah, and it was like, it got a conversation going, and it was a really fun project to do. So again, kind of going about this being a limiting factor, but like, I think saying that something is impossible is often saying that I don't want to do it. Everything is possible, it's just a matter of time. But some things are hard. And basically what I wanted to do by having a lot of this experience with motion is share some tools that I use to solve harder motion problems. So this was a bit of a revelation for me when I was working on my previous company's app, Zenly. And basically realizing that most animations are just the interpolation of values over time. And it's a very sort of mathematical way of thinking about animation, but if you think about something that grows, that's just changing the scale over time, or something that moves from one point to another is just changing the position over time. And when you do that with an animation curve, you get really nice results. And that really opens up basically a lot of possibilities. So there are two tools. There's Pop from Facebook, which they built for Paper, which was a super richly animated app, that basically it's very rich. It does a lot of stuff, but it allows you to build these crazy user interfaces and pretty much change any value that you want and animate any value that you want, like font sizes, and you can even build your own properties. And then there's Interpolate, which is a library that I built that is a lot more lightweight, but it's in Swift, and it does kind of takes a similar approach and tries to, and basically lets you kind of build more things yourself. So those are really, really important tools if you want to create these kind of animations, rich gesture-driven animations. And the other kind of animations, the one that's not interpolation of values over time, is basically keyframe animations. So if you think about more sort of Disney-style things of like things moving and don't have an example. Yeah, so Lottie. Lottie is the solution from Airbnb, which they open sourced. Facebook also open sourced a very similar thing called keyframes. That's also very good. And with them, you can actually take an animation from After Effects and just export that into a vector animation on iOS and Android for Lottie. And yeah, it's super, super powerful, and you can create really exciting things that were super difficult to do otherwise. So this is an example of something that we did at Zenly. So my designer and product owner came to me and said, basically, so Zenly is a location tracking app for teenagers, and basically what they wanted to do is have like a GPS mode where you see your friend on the other side, and as you move with your phone, you get this very much like TomTom GPS effect. And that's really not possible to do with MapKit. The MapKit doesn't support this kind of animation that we wanted to do. But MapKit does open the API for the camera. So then it was all about realizing basically how to interpolate the different values of the camera in order to get that animation that we wanted. There was quite a lot of math involved, but it looks really cool. And it made this kind of user interface possible. The third thing I want to talk about is actually about my work at Spotify. So I'm part of this team. We are the studios. And our role is trying to figure out radical new ideas for the music listening experience. And it's not a very interesting story, because there's not a lot that I can actually talk about. However, we do a lot of prototyping. And I kind of wanted to share my experience with prototyping and the value that prototypes have. So trying to have sort of these radical new ideas and trying to validate those ideas is very much an iterative process. And iterating inside the app is something that's very, very expensive. Not only because developing production quality code takes time and thought and effort, but also if you want to A/B test something, you have to run this A/B test for, well, define the test, define the subset, have an intake period, run it for a couple of weeks, analyze the result. It takes a really, really long time. And it's hard to get this sort of fast validation that you need if you're still figuring out your idea. And also, I think prototypes are really useful because of this flattish world that we live in, of slightly sort of richer, gesture-driven apps. And the specs that we're used to don't really cut it for this world. So this is another takeaway of just like ways to annoy a developer with bad specs. I think a lot of specs often forget edge cases and empty states, and that really upsets developers. And they forget size changes and different device sizes, and generally just not considering interactions. And I think all of these are solved with good prototyping tools. So I wanted to basically look a bit at the prototyping landscape today, because in my team, we tried all of the solutions. And when we look at prototyping, I basically see three different types of prototyping. There's the low-fidelity prototype, which is basically when you're still figuring out what you're building, and you want to have something that's slightly richer than a sketch, but not necessarily much richer than that. And that's for really, really fast validation. Then there are interaction prototypes, which is when you're building these kind of rich user experiences, and you want to see and feel what they feel like. And then there are take-home prototypes. And take-home prototypes are more about creating an experience that you can actually live with and see what it'll be like for a user over time, and really check your ideas that way. So often, the tools of the designers are today pretty much Sketch and Sharpies. And they're very simple tools. And I think also, like, as developers, we should know how to use them. They're quite simple. But that's kind of the starting point of the prototyping journey. Now, when we want to do low-fidelity prototypes, the sort of popular tools are Marvel, which is this app, and Keynote. And Apple have a lot of great WWDC sessions about how to use Keynote for prototyping. And they do like crazy things and basically they have one about building a hardware toaster with Keynote. That's really, really cool. And these are fantastic for lo-fi sketches and having like clickable targets on things that you take a photo of, or like very basic sketch design. And you can iterate very fast that way. If you want to do something a bit richer, the really popular tool these days is Principle. Principle is very simple, but it creates really, really good prototypes. You get a real sense of the interaction. You see it on your phone. It's good. It's a great tool. But if you want to do like the super rich animations, it's really all about After Effects and origami. They're both really hard to master. There's a big learning curve. But the results are just incredible. And if you get to work with people who are very confident with these tools, you'll be as amazed and surprised as I was by what they're able to produce. Framer is becoming a lot more popular, and I think it's really good for this kind of audience, because it's both code-based and WYSIWYG. So as a developer, you're kind of happy. You can dig into the CoffeeScript and change things. But as a designer, you can it's a very similar user interface to Sketch. It's very flexible. You can use it with real data for some things. And it's a great tool, and it's becoming better all the time. And lastly, we have Xcode. And Xcode is really hard, really expensive, takes a long time, but it's the only place where you can create these like living take-home prototypes. And I think as a developer, the mindset here is not about creating an app the same way that you do your day-to-day work. It's more sort of a hackathon mindset. It's about trying to create something very quickly that works. And if you can convince your developers to do that, you can create these prototypes that will reveal more about your app and your idea. So yeah, I think basically the takeaway here is that there are a lot of prototyping solutions. You should choose the right one for what you're trying to validate and the timescale that you want to validate it in. And yeah, I'm just going to wrap up. So those were 3 stories about my experiences. I think designer and developer love that Fernando was talking about is possible. We can do it by basically having a different mindset as developers, that our job is basically to enable the vision of designers. And designers should basically have a more complete vision and provide a more complete vision through prototyping and through thinking through their specs a bit more. And ultimately, it's all about communication and empathy. And it's not so hard. And we can build great, delightful, transformative apps together. Thanks. So I think we're going to do questions now. Are there any questions? I'll just repeat the question. Yeah. So how many prototypes are you building per week? So we do design sprints, and we try to do 1 prototype per week. But sometimes when you really fall in love with an idea, you want to have the prototype more of an iteration on a previous prototype. Yeah. So. It's more of a long-term view, so it will take a while, but we do distribute them internally and get feedback that way. And, yeah. Sorry.
Hey, thanks for a great talk. You mentioned origami and Framer, and there are some export possibilities, like you can export some animation values and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Is that something you can really reuse in your production work, and how far this functionality is?
Yeah, so in my experience, the export tools, apart from After Effects with Lottie and one of these solutions, the export tools are not that production ready. And it's very good for communicating the idea and explaining it in a way that's easier to implement. But I wouldn't export the tools or the animations from Origami and implement them in production code. Yeah.
Right, thanks.
Hey, how do you validate your prototypes? Do you do it only in your team, or do you take it? How do you do that?
So initially in the team, then internally, then we do user testing, we do guerrilla testing. Yeah, and we have researchers. So part of the team is researchers, and they do the validation.
Hi, great talk. Can you go back to the slide on how to upset a developer? And just leave it there for the rest of the conference. And I know this could be like unfair, but if anyone has a slide on how to upset a designer, and then we can share it with the rest of the world, that will be great.
One over there.
You said that you run design sprints on Spotify. How is that between designers and developers?
We use the Google Ventures model. So it's basically 5 days of defining the problem, defining solutions, and then we do like 2-3 days of prototyping.
Yes, how many people join the sessions usually?
Like max of 5-6 people. Thanks.